Welcome everybody to our third day of moral freedom. Last time we discussed compatibilism. What is compatibilism? Well, an easy way to express it is as follows. Compatibilism is simply the rejection of premise 2 of the HCD argument. Now, what is the HCD argument? We've talked about that for 2 sessions already, so you should be able to rattle it off. The HCD argument, in other words, the argument for hard chronological determinism, looks as follows. Premise 1, chronological determinism is true. In other words, it is true that the past guarantees the future. The second premise is if chronological determinism is true, then each human action is not morally free. And then the conclusion drawn from that is that each human action is not morally free. Compatibilism is a rejection of the second premise of that argument. And I actually put that in the chat box. Premise 2 of the HCD argument says, if the past guarantees the future, then each human action is not morally free. A compatibilist is one who says, even if the past guarantees everything that I do, that doesn't mean that everything I do is not morally up to me, not morally free, not done morally freely. It could still be that I am acting freely, even if, so says the compatibilist, everything that I do has been shit out of the remote past before I was born. Now, we looked at that view last time. Now we're shifting gears. We're shifting gears to the incompatibilist side. Incompatibilism is the view that chronological determinism and other forms of determinism similar to it precludes human free action. Incompatibilism is the view that determinism, at least certain forms, like the specific traditional form we're looking at in this class, chronological determinism, rules out human free action. In other words, human free action is not compatible with CD. So obviously, it's clear that incompatibilism accepts premise 2 of the HCD argument, whereas compatibilism rejects it, incompatibilism accepts it. An incompatibilist is someone says, if everything that I do was, for example, shit out of the remote past before I was born, I didn't do that freely. I didn't do that morally freely. Okay? I can't be morally responsible for what I do if what I do has been shit out of the remote past before I was born, even if I meet whatever other criteria there are for moral responsibility, like being an adult, having moral concepts, not being on drugs, whatever. My actions being born of deliberation, whatever. So incompatibilism is an acceptance of premise 2 of the HCD argument. That should all be clear. By the way, that's why I like to organize the moral freedom segment around the HCD argument. Not only is the HCD argument titillating in how offensive it is right away, because right away it says, in effect, that no one's morally responsible for anything because um, um, chronological determinism is true, which is a very it's a very stark way to begin. Not only is that the case, but for pedagogical reasons, we can organize all the views that we'll be discussing in this segment around that argument. Some views accept some parts of that argument, some views reject some parts of that argument. We can actually pick out all the general views that are viable in the freedom literature around that argument. So I think it's pedagogically effective to start there. And we're seeing so far. Compatibilism rejects premise 2. Now we've moved on to incompatibilism. It accepts premise 2. Now, remember how I said last time that compatibilism itself is agnostic on whether premise 1 is true or not? The same goes for incompatibilism. Incompatibilism is agnostic on the first premise of the HCD argument. In other words, some incompatibilists say that chronological determinism is true. Those are called, by the way, we already know what they're called. Those are called hard chronological determinists. Okay, and there's other incompatibilists that say premise one is false. The most common of these are called libertarians. And I put this on the slide for you guys, libertarians, and I also put, obviously, hard chronological determinism. Libertarians are incompatibilists who say that human actions are sometimes free, and they also reject premise one of the HCD argument. So as I say, to repeat, libertarianism is just one form of incompatibilism. It's a form that rejects CD, in other words, premise one of the HCD argument, and accepts that human actions are sometimes free, even though they accept, as incompatibilists, premise two of the HCD argument. Now, a hard chronological determinist is simply an acceptor of premise two of the HCD argument and premise one. And if you bring those two together, a hard chronological determinist says that no human ever acts freely. No one's ever morally responsible for what they do. Okay, so that's a kind of, at one and the same time, a review of what we did, of the basic concepts, and also a nice segue into our material for today. Because our material for today is incompatibilism, and I've already articulated what incompatibilism is. Now let's just jump right into arguments for incompatibilism. Now, we kind of already seen some arguments for compatibilism in two ways already. One, I gave you a quick defense of premise two of the HCD argument on day one of moral freedom at the very end. And also, we, for lack of a better way to put it, we shit pretty heavily on compatibilism, which is the opposite view. We've raised severe problems, it seems, for all the arguments that compatibilism used to defend their view. And we also raise problems for the main forms of compatibilism, the Hobartian compatibilism, Stasian compatibilism, and combo compatibilism. In addition to that, though, today I'm going to focus on building a more robust positive case for incompatibilism. Kind of, so a positive case in the manner that that I did in our first day on moral freedom, except the argument that I'll give you is much more involved and rigorous. Cool. Now, one of the most popular, one of the most powerful too, arguments in favor of incompatibilism is called the consequence argument. So there's actually two main versions of the consequence argument that I'm going to go over today, but the basic idea of the consequence argument, no matter the version, is this. If chronological determinism is true, then that means our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before we were born. Now, since the remote past is not up to us, obviously true, if CD is true, then our actions, which would be guaranteed by that remote past, for reasons that you already know, but I'm not going to go into, would not be up to us either. Okay, I'll say that again. The basic idea of the consequence argument is this. If the past guarantees the future, if chronological determinism is true, then each of our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before we were even born. Now, since the remote past, uncontroversially, is not up to us, we don't have any say over the past before we were born. If CD is true, then our actions, which would be guaranteed by that remote past, are not up to us, and so are not free in the sense required for moral responsibility. In other words, they're not morally free. Because remember, moral freedom is the sort of freedom required for moral responsibility. Okay, as I said, there's two versions of the consequence argument. There's two versions of that general idea. I actually have names for the two versions here. The ability version, and the other one's called, version 2 is called the control version. So let's look at the ability version first. Here's how it reads right off the slide. If chronological determinism is true, then our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births. Premise 1. Premise 2, if our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then we do not have the ability to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we do it. 3. If we do not have the ability to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we in fact do it, then our actions are not free. Now, of course, even though I'm just using the word free, understand we're talking about moral freedom. They're not morally free. So notice, by a series of HS's, hypothetical syllogism, one of our valid or popular valid argument forms, by a sequence of HS's, we get this conclusion validly deduced from these premises. So this is a valid argument. It is logically impossible for the conclusion to be false on the assumption that the premises are true. If all you knew coming into this class was that 1 is true, and that 2 is true, and that 3 is true, would that be enough information for you to know for sure that the conclusion is true? Hell yes. That's what it means to say that it's a valid argument. So the only way that this argument can fail to be sound is if what? At least one of the premises is false. So what I want to do, as I normally do, this is the pattern this is the careful pattern I usually exercise throughout all of my classes. Let's start at the premises. Let's look at the rationale for each premise. I have here the rationale for premise 1 right away. Let's do that. Let's scroll this sucker down a little bit. Okay. So here's the rationale for premise 1. Just by definition, if CD is true, then our actions are guaranteed by the past, because CD is the view that the past guarantees the future. Cool. Now, the key point is that the past goes farther back than humans do, than any of us do. So when you bring that fact, the past is older than any of us, plus CD, just by definition, when you bring those two facts together, you get premise 1. If CD is true, then my doing this right now is guaranteed by the past before I was even born. It was shit out of the juggernaut force of reality before I was even around. There's nothing else to say about premise 1. I'm going to put a slash through it as we've been doing. Slash. We've bottomed out in intuitiveness, at least at this level. This is designed, as you guys know, for 100, 200, maybe 300 or 400 level. It's definitely an undergraduate level, okay, class. Usually I would present this material in a survey course, like if we're talking about even in an ethics course. So definitely in an intro course, but even in an ethics course, because talking about moral freedom is relevant to ethics. Remember, I said at the very beginning of our segment on moral freedom that discussing moral freedom is very important, because if nothing that humans do is up to them, if humans can never act more freely in a way that's required for moral responsibility, then there seems to be little point to talking about what we ought to do. Anyway, let's go on to premise 2. Circle this because this is the one we're focusing on. Why is it the case that if our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our birth, then we don't have the ability to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we do it? Well, it seems pretty goddamn obvious, but here's the formal argument that I give you on the slide. 2.1, the first premise in defense of premise 2. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before we were born, then our actions are guaranteed by what we do not have the ability to change. Now, I call this as obvious, because the past before we were born, we don't have the ability to change, barring time travel scenarios that I'm not going to go into now because that will derail us. But remember, I did talk about time travel already in our first day of moral freedom, and showing how CD being true does not preclude the possibility of going back in time, because there's various things we could mean by that. So I think that discussion will be helpful here more if you are thinking it's a viable option that maybe we can go back in time and change the past. But it seems like I'll just leave it at this. My all-encompassing mind, I have a totalizing mind. I want to like discuss everything, and that kind of makes things more complicated than they need to be at sometimes. I really want to talk about that time travel issue, but it's pretty much a non-starter. You can't travel back in time and change the past in a way that would help you in this situation. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then our actions are guaranteed by what we don't have the ability to change. It's obvious that the remote past before our births, before we were even around, is not up to us. Okay. If someone says that it is in some sense up to us, then it's really not the true past. That's how we can at least put it that way. Okay. Just to bracket off possible tangential avenues that we might go down that I don't want to go down now. But of course, email me if you have any thoughts about that. So I'm going to put a slash through that. 2.1 is obviously true. That's not the controversial premise. Really, to be honest with you, especially if you have incompatibilist sentiments, none of the premises of any of these arguments are going to be rather controversial to you. But 2.1, if you're going to find any controversy anywhere, it's not going to be in 2.1. If anything, it's going to be here at 2.2. 2.2 says, if our actions are guaranteed by what we do not have the ability to change, then we don't have the ability to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we do it. So if our actions are shit out of what we don't have any power to change, then we don't have the power to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we in fact do it. So when you bring these two, and that seems pretty intuitive as well. Actually, I'll say a few words about it, but that seems pretty intuitive. Well, I'll just slash that for the time being. But think about it. Why is 2.2 true? Let me give you a concrete example. If my, say, lifting, here's a pen. If my lifting the pen right now is guaranteed by what I do not have the ability to change, like attend to those words. If my lifting the pen right now in exactly the way that I do is guaranteed, is shit out of what I do not have any ability to change, then it seems obvious that I don't have the ability to change the fact that I lift the pen right now. Okay. How to put this? My lack of ability to change whether the sufficient cause of effect A, this or whatever effect we're talking about, my inability to change whether the sufficient cause of effect A occurring right now exactly as it does entails my lack of ability to change whether effect A occurs right now exactly how it does. My lack of ability, I think that's a good way to put it, my lack of ability to change or alter whether the sufficient cause of effect A occurring right now exactly as it does, that entails my lack of ability to change whether effect A occurs right now exactly as it does. I guess you could put it this way also. 2.2 is simply an expression of a very intuitive principle. We can call this principle, I would have liked to put that on the slide. Okay. Oh, okay. I do have the rationale for 2.2, but I don't put the principle. This is a common principle in philosophy, so I'm just going to mention it. The principle is the transfer principle for lack of ability. 2.2 is simply an expression of the transfer principle for lack of ability. What does this principle say? It says something like this. We do not have the ability to change what is guaranteed by what we do not have the ability to change. Let me put that in there. Oh, I do. At least I have that on 2.2. Okay, good. We do not have the ability to change what is guaranteed by what we do not have the ability to change. That seems pretty obvious. I don't have the ability to change the fact that I lift the pen right now if my lifting the pen right now was guaranteed by what I don't have the ability to change. Pretty simple. This is called the transfer principle. I'll put it up here. Boom, transfer principle for lack of ability. Transfer principle for lack of ability. That's all 2.2 is really an expression of. And that principle seems pretty obvious, right? Here's a formal way to put it. And this is how a typical analytic philosopher would put it. If proposition P is true, like assume that's true, and also we don't have the ability to change the fact that P is true, it's another fact there, and if Q is guaranteed by P, and we don't have the ability to change the fact that Q is guaranteed by P, then what does that mean ultimately? It means that Q is true and we don't have the ability to change the fact that Q is true. That's a formal way to express the transfer principle of lack of ability. For lack of ability. If a certain proposition P is true, right, assume it's true, and we don't have the ability to change whether it's true, and if Q is shit out of P automatically, right, and we don't have the ability to change the fact that Q is shit out of P, then that just means that Q is true, and we don't have the ability to change the fact that Q is true. That's the transfer principle for lack of ability. In more commonsensical terms, look at the slide. We don't have the ability to change what is guaranteed by what we don't have the ability to change. If I don't have the ability to change the fact that I lift the pen right now, if my lifting the pen right now was shit out of what I don't have the ability to change. Should be pretty simple. I'm going over it in rigorous detail and saying it in different ways to drive the point home because I know, first of all, in philosophy, everything's subject to criticism, so you have to be prepared for that. But also, I know that this particularly is the sore spot that compatibilists are going to set their sights on when they try to resist this argument. Okay. Now, okay, so we have, so far, we did premise 1 and premise 2. I think they seem pretty obvious. I just gave you a full rationale, a full formal argument for premise 2, so I'm going to put a slash through it. And just think about it again. Now, take that information and go back to premise 2. Does it make sense? If your action, think of it in terms of you. Don't make it abstract. If your actions are guaranteed by the remote past before you were even fucking born, then do you have the ability to do otherwise than what you do at the moment when you do it? No. That's what premise 2 says. It's based on the transfer principle for lack of ability. Now let's look at premise 3. Why think that premise 3 is true? Premise 3 says if we do not have the ability to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we do it, then our actions are not free. They're not morally free. Now, many of us also take premise 3 to be fairly obvious. Here's the rationale for it right here. Bang. After all, many of us hold that the following principle is true, which I have on the slide right here, the principle of alternative possibilities. The principle of alternative possibilities, which seems obvious, as I say, you can word it like this. S does action A, whatever it is, freely, only if S could have done otherwise than A at the moment when S did A. Now notice saying that this statement right here, this principle, the principle of alternative possibilities, notice that that's just premise 3 in a different form. It's actually premise 3 in its contrapositive form. Remember the contrapositive relationship? The contrapositive relationship looks like this. I'll put it in the chat box. If X, then Y, that just equals, that's logically equivalent to saying, and this is captured by modus tollens in effect, and as I think I mentioned in our basic logic segment, if you looked at those videos or you've attended those lectures. If X then Y is logically equivalent to if not Y, then not X. You should see that they're logically equivalent because remember what conditional says in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. When I say if x then y, I'm saying two things that amount to the same thing. I'm saying that x is sufficient for y and y is necessary for x. Those are two ways of saying the same thing. Let's focus on the latter way, the second way that I said it. When I say if x then y, I'm saying y is necessary for x. So what does that tell you? If you don't have fucking y, you don't have x. There you go. So that's why they're logically equivalent. Good. Now, why did I say that? Notice that the principle of alternative possibilities is the same thing as premise 3, only in the contrapositive form. The principle of alternative possibilities is saying in standard conditional form, if S does action A freely, then S could have done otherwise than A at the moment when he did it. And premise 3 is saying, well, you can just deduce something like what premise 3 is saying by just doing the contrapositive on this guy. If S could not have done otherwise than A at the moment when he did it, then S doesn't do action A freely. And I worded it a little differently at 3, but here it is. If we don't, I use the term ability to do otherwise. If S does not have the ability to do otherwise than what he does when he does it, then S's action is not free. S is not doing A freely. Cool? So you should all see that premise 3 is just another way to express a very intuitive principle called the principle of alternative possibilities. And just think about it in your own life. Don't just, I know it can be very abstract when we think of it in terms of S. Who the hell is S? Sam, Sarah. No, think of it as you. I do action A freely only if I could have done otherwise than A at the moment when I did it. Such that if, and here's the contrapositive, and this is what premise 3 is saying, such that if I did not have the ability to do otherwise, if I could not have done otherwise at the moment when I did it, then that means I didn't do it freely. That seems pretty intuitive. So I'll leave it at that. We can put a slash through. I'm not going to go back up, but we can put a slash through 3. So it looks like we have a sound argument for incompatibilism, such that if CD is true, then none of our actions are free. And if you bring that together with the multifaceted barrage that I gave you guys over the last 2 sessions in defense of premise 1, then we have seemingly a sound argument for hard chronological determinism, which has a seemingly unsavory result. I say seemingly because it may not be bad. I'm working on this in my own writing personally as I record this now. It seems to have an unsavory consequence that no one is ever morally responsible for what they do. I don't know how bad that actually is upon scrutiny. It violates our intuitions and how but I don't know how much of a drastic change it would result in. Maybe I'll get into that a little bit in our Moral Freedom Day 4. Well, I guess Moral Freedom Day 5. I'll say a few things about that, and I won't go into that now. But even there, I won't go into too much detail about that. All right. Where are we at now? Okay, well, let's look at attacks. That's how we always do our arguments. We see the argument, present the best case for it, looking at its rationales, and then look at potential objections to it. So I'm assuming you guys can come up with potential objections to it, and I would say if you're really engaged with this material, I think it would be important to pause the video right now to do so. But I'm going to go ahead and give you some of the major compatibilist objections to the consequence argument version 1, the abilities version. So the typical compatibilist is not going to object to premise 1. That's an obvious one, barring the time travel scenarios. They're going to go after premise 2. Some compatibilists actually go after premise 3 as well. So I'll give you what they would say to attack both premise 2 and premise 3. But here's how a compatibilist might reject premise 2. Compatibilists might say that sometimes we do have the ability to do something other than what we in fact do. In other words, sometimes we do have the ability to do otherwise, even if all our actions are guaranteed by the remote past that we do not have the ability to change. A compatibilist might say, to repeat, that sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes we might just very well have the ability to do something other than what we do, even if all of our actions are shit out of the remote past that is totally not up to us. Let me make this more concrete, like I usually do. I like to say the same things in different ways so something sticks. Some people like the more abstract way to put it. My mathematics people, my computer science people really like that kind of format. Mostly everybody else likes a more visual, more concrete format. So let me put it concrete, and as I do, more so on the slide here. And actually, I'll even make it more concrete than the slide in a second. Okay, well, no, I guess on the slide I'm using the example of the pen, so I'll do it that way. According to this compatibilist strategy, even if it was guaranteed from the remote past that S, Sam, Sarah, whoever, does not do action A at time 1, it may still be the case that S has the ability to do that action at time 1. So concretely put, in terms of the pen, according to this compatibilist strategy, the strategy of attacking premise 2, even if it was shit out of the remote past, even if it was absolutely full-fledgedly guaranteed by the remote past that I do not lift the pen, I'm keeping that mofo down, even if it's been guaranteed by the remote past that I do not lift the pen at time 1, it may still be the case that I have the ability to lift the pen at that very same time. Now, if you have incompatibilist intuitions, you're going to be like, what? What the hell? You have to play devil's advocate here. You could be so locked in to the incompatibilist framework of thinking, way of thinking, that you can't even see where these people are coming from. But you always have to, and this is the importance of taking a philosophy class, taking literature classes where you read novels and see from other points of view, but especially with a philosophy class. You get a chance you get a chance to see how very smart people can disagree. So if you're locked into one way of viewing and there's been smart people saying the opposite, the burden is on you to see what the hell could be motivating their view. It's a call to empathize. Okay, that's why philosophy is at the heart of a liberal arts education. It's about cultivating empathetic citizens. So I know a lot of my Texas students. If you're in Texas hearing this, you're going to be like, what the hell? How could anybody ever deny premise 2? And I understand. I'm empathetic enough to know that you feel that way. But you have to realize that there's very smart people that think that, and I'll put it in terms of the pen case again, even if it was guaranteed by the remote past that I do not lift the pen at time 1, it may still be true that I have the ability to lift the pen at time 1. So how could this be? They're going to at least give, just because I want you to be empathetic with them doesn't mean that they're let off the hook. They don't have to give an explanation for why. How could this be? Now, the advocate of compatibilism who adopts this strategy to attack premise 2 is going to give most likely something like the following explanation. They're going to give something like the following account of the ability to do otherwise. They have to give some sort of account of the ability to do otherwise where it makes sense that even if it was shit out of the past that I don't lift the pen at time 1, I still have the ability to lift the motherfucker. They have to give some sort of account of the ability to do otherwise in order to make sense of that. So here it is right here. Here's the compatibilist. And you might differ on the details of this, but this is how a typical compatibilist is going to express what it means to have the ability to do otherwise. And their account is going to be compatible with determinism being true. All right. S has the ability to do otherwise than what he does at time 1 if and only if it is the case that S would have done otherwise at time 1 had S tried to do otherwise at time 1. So that's their account. That's what they're saying. That's what's grounding their attack of premise 2, at least according to the strategy that I'm raising right now. They say, hey, it makes sense, according to the account that I just gave you of the ability to do otherwise. It makes sense to say that even if it was guaranteed that I don't lift the pen at time 1, I still could have the ability to lift the pen at time 1. Let me make this concrete for you. Imagine it's the case that even though it is determined that I don't lift the pen at time 1, imagine it's the case that even though it's been determined that I don't lift the pen at time 1, I would have lifted it if I tried. If what we just imagined is true, that even though it was determined that I don't lift the pen, I would have lifted the pen if I tried, which actually seems pretty reasonable. After all, I'm a human. I'm the sort of creature that can lift pens and not. If what we just imagined is true, that means that I have the ability to do otherwise, even if CD is true. The question is, of course, is what we just imagined true? And in the compatibilist's favor, it seems like it definitely is, if you think about it. Let me put it this way. Even if it has been determined that I do not lift the pen, it is still nevertheless the case that I would have lifted it had I tried. I would not have been able, say, to fly away had I tried, right? I couldn't have been, at time 1, I couldn't have just flew away, but I could have lifted the pen had I tried. I would not have been able to fly away or to turn into a dinosaur had I tried, but I surely would have been able to lift the pen had I tried. Although I'm not the sort of creature who can fly, I am the sort of creature that can lift or not lift pens. Compatibilism is concluding, therefore, that we can have the ability to do otherwise, even if all of our actions are guaranteed by the remote past that we do not have the ability to change. So you see, they have a relatively, this isn't a judgment, a negative judgment. They have a relatively watered down view of the ability to do otherwise. And it's not like this watered down view is not like it is tracking with reality. I have, as humans, many abilities. I'm the sort of creature that can dance. Like I'm able-bodied. I can start dancing right now. I can go blah, 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 blah. But even if it was guaranteed by the remote past that I don't go blah, 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 blah at a given time, it was still in my ability as a human to do that. I would have done that had I tried. So go back to the original example. Here's why it's supposed to make sense for you. Well, here's why it's supposed to make sense to reject premise 2, according to the compatibilist way of thinking of things. Even if it's been guaranteed by the remote past that I don't lift my pen right now, I still have the ability to do otherwise, because I'm the sort of human, I'm the sort of creature who could lift the pen if I wanted to. So what do you think about that? That's it. Now, the incompatibilist is going to have an obvious response to this. As rhetorically effectively as effectively as I tried to put the compatibilist attack of premise 2, and hopefully it was somewhat effective, the incompatibilist is not going to be too moved by such an attack. An incompatibilist is going to say, hey, look, if chronological determinism is true and all of S's actions are guaranteed by the remote past, then S would have tried to do otherwise at time 1, only if it were guaranteed by the remote past that he would have tried to do otherwise. I know some of you are thinking just that. You might have not have put it that carefully and that precisely, but I know some of you were thinking just that. The incompatibilist is saying this. Look, if the past guarantees the future, and all of S's actions were guaranteed by the remote past before he was born, when he doesn't have the ability to change, then S would have tried to do otherwise at time 1, only if it were guaranteed by the remote past that he would try to do otherwise at time 1. So it's directly, the incompatibilist is directly responding to this principle right here, this watered down principle of the ability this watered down, not principle, but account, we might say, of the ability to do otherwise. Look at it this way, and in alignment with how I put it on the slide. If CD is true and all of S's actions are guaranteed by the remote past, such that it has been guaranteed that S does not try to do otherwise than what he does, then S does not have the actual, S does not have the factual ability to do otherwise. But it is the factual, the actual ability to do otherwise, not the hypothetical, or as I say on the slide, or you might say counterfactual ability to do otherwise, that is operative in the consequence argument. So, like, let's put it back in the pen case. The compatibilist is saying that even if it's been guaranteed by the remote past that I don't lift the pen right now at time 1, that I still had the ability to lift the pen, if it's the case that I would have lifted it had I tried, okay? The incompatibilist is going to say, okay, yeah, sure, you have the counterfactual ability to do otherwise. Yeah, in effect, had the deterministic chain been different, you would have done otherwise. But you don't have the actual and factual ability to do otherwise. It was locked in by the remote past, completely necessitated that you would never lift the pen. So all things considered, we might put it that way. All things considered, you don't have the ability to do otherwise. That's maybe a nice way to put it, instead of actual and factual, because that might just push the debate off one step in a way. The compatibilist could say, well, as a human, he's the sort of creature that can lift the pen or not lift the pen, so he does have the actual and factual ability to do otherwise. And so that maybe that language is not the best. Maybe it's best to say, all things considered, does he have the ability to do otherwise? And no, he does not. Because if CD is true, and if it's been guaranteed by the remote past that I don't lift the pen right now, I don't have in an all things considered sense. And that's what I mean by actual sense. That's what I mean by a factual sense. I don't have the actual and factual ability to lift my pen, all things considered. You see that? I mean, it's only if I don't consider all the picture and I just abstract, just focus in on, oh, he's as a human, I don't pay attention to the other factors, but just as a human, does he have ability to lift the pen or not if he's able-bodied? Yeah, he does. Okay, so that's fine. Everybody agrees with that. It's not like the incompatibilist is disagreeing with that. They agree. But the relevant sense of the ability to do otherwise that's operative in the consequence argument, the abilities version, is the all things considered ability to do otherwise. And that's what I'm calling the actual and factual TLC. Ooh, on the TLC tip. That's what I'm calling the actual and factual ability to do otherwise. Okay? All right. Now, I guess what we could do is, in fact, we can make this all explicit. We can kind of nip, so to say, the compatibilist objection that we're looking at right in the bud if we stick in the right words in the original argument. If we stick in like the word actual and factual in the original argument, maybe we can just cut them off at the pass, so to say. That's the idea. So look at it this way. We can say if our actions are guaranteed by the remote, I'm looking at premise 2. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then at no point in time do we have the actual ability. I hate how that does that. Do we have the actual? I'll just write A/F, actual and factual. And no, the all things considered ability to do otherwise. The ability to do anything other than what we do at the moment when we do it. And if at no point in time do we have the actual and factual ability to do otherwise than what we do at the moment when we do it, then our actions are not free. So you see, I stuck in this phrase in the argument in order to cut the compatibilist objection off at the pass, so to say, right, nip it in the bud, obviate it, make it not even have the possibility to arise. Because we're not talking about, I'm stipulating in effect that I'm not talking about any counterfactual ability to do otherwise. I'm talking about the all things considered, the actual ability to do otherwise. And so if we word the argument a little bit more precisely, we could nip in the bud objection, the compatibilist objection to premise 2. All right, now let's move on to the attack on premise 3. Okay, let's see. Trying to get this down. I don't know why it's not moving. Okay, all right, here we go. So a compatibilist might also attack premise 3. Remember, premise 3 is just the contrapositive form of the principle of alternative possibilities, which says freedom, in effect, requires there being alternative possibilities, such that if you don't have any alternative possibilities at the time of acting, you didn't act freely. You can't act freely. A compatibilist might actually say that the principle of alternative possibilities, as obvious as it sounds, like it seems like it's intuitively true. If I can't do otherwise, but at the time, like if I don't have the ability to do otherwise, if I don't have any, if I really objectively, not just what I think subjectively, but if I really objectively do not have any alternative possibilities but to punch the person in the head right at that time, then a lot of us think, well, then I didn't punch him in the head right at that time freely. In order for me to be doing it freely, there has to be many ways that things could go. But a compatibilist might say, no, 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 no. You could still be doing that action freely, even if there's not really alternative possibilities. In other words, and in short, the compatibilist might attack the principle of alternative possibilities. Now, the most famous contemporary attack on the principle of alternative possibilities has been launched by a guy named Harry Frankfurt, a great porn name, by the way. You can picture the guy with like a gold chain caught up in the hirsute, the blooming chest hair, Italian horn, caught up in there. Anyway, the most famous attack on this principle has been developed by a guy named Harry Frankfurt and people who are followers of Harry Frankfurt, for lack of a better term. Now, Harry Frankfurt tries to illustrate that the principle of alternative possibilities is false by coming up with cases where S, the agent, has no alternative possibilities, but is nevertheless still morally responsible for what he does and thus is acting freely. Because remember, the sort of freedom we're dealing with is the sort of freedom required for moral responsibility, such that if you're morally responsible for something, you definitely had to have been doing it freely. Okay, that's just the relationship. So, in other words, Harry Frankfurt develops what is now known as Frankfurt-style cases. These cases are supposed to be cases where even though an agent doesn't have any alternative possibilities at the time of acting, they're still acting in a way that's where they're morally responsible and thus acting freely. The principle of alternative possibility says if you don't have any alternative possibilities at the time of acting, you're not acting freely. Frankfurt-style cases are informal, at least, counterexamples to that principle. Frankfurt-style cases are cases where agents have no alternative possibilities, but are nevertheless doing what they do freely. So here's a good, a famous case that you see oftentimes talked about, like online, the Franny and Zoe case. There's a Franny and Zoe Frankfurt-style case. Now, Franny and Zoe, here's how it works. They're partners in crime. Franny is worried that Zoe is going to back out of the assassination plot at the last minute, whatever it is. Maybe it's to kill the Pope or somebody like that, okay? So what Franny does, she's nervous here. She's like, oh, I think Zoe's going to fucking back out, Franny resolves to use her extraordinary powers of telepathic mind control, if necessary, to ensure that Zoe will go through with the plan no matter what. So you see, Franny's a little worried about Zoe's resolve to go ahead and do what needs to be done and just make up for some reason why it has to be that Zoe pulls the trigger. Maybe it's a gang initiation or something. Whatever. I don't know. Okay. So Zoe has extraordinary powers of telepathic mind control. So she's going to watch Zoe, and if it looks like Zoe's going to back out, Franny's just going to intervene and make Zoe pull the trigger, say. I guess that's the method of assassination. Okay, so that's the scenario. But when the time comes, Zoe ends up pulling the trigger without any intervention. Franny's watching, nervous. Oh, she ain't gonna go through with it. If she's not gonna go through it, I'm gonna zap her. I'm gonna zap her if she doesn't go through. But she did end up going through with it. So Zoe is, because she ended up going through with it on her own. Zoe's apparently morally responsible for what she does in this case. And since she's morally responsible, right? Like typically, a person on the street at least would say in that scenario, maybe you've already been corrupted by philosophy. But a typical person on the street, if they heard that scenario, they would be like, hell yeah, she's morally responsible for what she does. And that intuitive sense of moral responsibility, that everyman sense of moral responsibility, is at least operative in Frankfurt's mind. So she's apparently morally responsible for what she does and thus acted freely, since freedom is required for moral responsibility. But it is also seemingly true that Zoe could not have done otherwise at the time. She had no alternative possibilities but to do what she did. Because if she was going to do otherwise, Franny would have zapped her. So she really had objectively no alternative possibilities but one, and yet she still acted freely. That's the idea. So this example apparently shows that the ability to do otherwise is not a necessary condition for free action, contrary to what premise 3 of the abilities version of the consequent argument is saying. Now, I, 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 I don't know. I don't want to get into this discussion, but it's just I know that a typical student might come at this point and say, well, Zoe might have pulled out at the last second without the partner knowing she was going to do so, without Franny knowing she was going to do so. Um, and I guess I would say that might that saying that to try to get out of the problem and try to defend premise 3 might be a distraction, might miss the point. The central idea, I guess we can put it this way. Let's assume that Zoe fully wanted to do whatever it is, X. Let's just call it X. Assume that Zoe, or whoever, S. Assume that S fully wanted to do X, and unbeknownst to her, she could not, for whatever reason, do otherwise at that point. We're gonna still say she did it freely, at least so the compatibilist who objects to the principle of alternative possibilities would try to insist. Because she fully wanted to do X. It was just that unbeknownst to her, there was constraints that made it such that there were not really alternative possibilities. Now, here's another issue that I don't really, maybe we shouldn't go into, but one might insist that at least at some point in the agent's history, at some point in her development, there needed to be alternative possibilities in order for her to have acted freely in the assassination. You might say, in other words, you might try to readjust to premise 3 to say, well, even if at the time of acting you don't have to have alternative possibilities, at least at one point in the history of your development you have to have alternative possibilities, so you could have shaped yourself into such a character that can then be doing actions freely. And then that would be enough. Even that watered down principle of alternative possibilities, which doesn't say in order, see, the robust form of the principle says in order to be doing the specific action freely, you have to have alternative possibilities at the very time of acting. In the adjusted version of the principle, you might word it as follows, something like S is doing action A freely only if, at least at some point in the development of her character, she had alternative possibilities, and that would be all that that you would need for the consequence argument. Because if CD is true, there were never any alternative possibilities. So even on that watered down version of the principle of alternative possibilities, it looks like you're still not free if CD is true. But actually, the compatibilist could even develop Frankfurt style cases to show even that watered down version of the principle is false. The compatibilist could reply with what is known as global Frankfurt style cases, where I don't know if you guys ever seen the Adjustment Bureau movie. It's sort of like the Adjustment Bureau in the movie Adjustment Bureau. there's an intervener, such as like God, right? Watching from the time of your birth. And so it's not like Franny in the local case ready to intervene on Zoe if she's going to pull out in that specific case. But imagine a global intervener, like a God who's watching you from the time of your birth, ready to intervene at any point where you make a move that the God or the intervener doesn't want you to make. So imagine that the intervener never has to intervene. In this case, the person seemingly is morally responsible, even without ever having had alternative possibilities. So imagine from the time of your birth, there's this God figure, like this God version of Franny, ready to intervene anytime you're going to make a move that it doesn't want you to make. But it's even though it's always ready to intervene, let's assume it's a case where it never does, because you always, by coincidence, whatever, happen to make the right moves. Since you're always doing what you want to do, at least when you get older enough to have wants and stuff. Since well, I guess you have the drive from the beginning, but it seems like what you ultimately end up doing, you're doing freely, even though you never had alternative possibilities. So you see how the debate could go. We can then turn, in other words, to that watered-down version of PAP, principle of alternative possibilities, and then the compatibilists could even try to attack that with global, what's known as global-style Frankfurt cases. So I don't know. There's dissertations still being written as of today on whether Frankfurt cases really do succeed in showing that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. Some people saying that Frankfurt in those cases are actually assuming that determinism is true. One of my mentors, I think Hugh McCann, I don't want to misspeak how he puts it, but he was a scholar in the philosophy of action. He always said the Frankfurt style cases are assuming that determinism is true. I remember that was his ritornello. He would repeat that all the time. But I'm not going to get into that now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bypass the whole goddamn discussion by going to consequence argument version 2, which doesn't even rely on this much maligned and much supported at the same time, this contentious principle, the principle of alternative possibilities. The control version doesn't even rely on it at all. So I want to turn to that right now. And I think that gives me an out, so to say, so I don't have to discuss in more detail than I already did how that Frankfurt debate could unfold. So let's turn to it. Fresh start. Still the same basic idea, but a fresh start. I think a more powerful version. I think this is a more robust version. Premise 1. Same premise 1 as the original premise 1. It's the same premise 1 as the abilities version premise 1. If CD is true, then our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births. That's obvious. Good. We can move on. Premise 2. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then we have no control over whether we perform our action. You see, it shifted now. The language shifted to control. Janet Jackson. Okay? Control. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then we have no control over whether we perform our actions. Now, premise 3 says if we have no control over whether we perform our actions, then our actions are not free. Therefore, ultimately, by a series of HS's again, if CD is true, then our actions are not free. Okay. All right, so let's go down. Let's look at the rationale for each of these premises. That's how it goes. We know the rationale for premise 1, obvious, barring the time travel scenarios. Now, what about the rationale for premise 2? It's pretty hard to deny, right? If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before we were born, then we don't have any control over whether we perform our damn actions. If my lifting the pen right now has been guaranteed by the remote past before I was born, in other words, guaranteed by what I have no control over, then do I have control over whether I lift the pen right now? No, I don't. It seems to be obvious. That's premise 2 in a nutshell, but here's the rigorous defense of it. Premise 2.1, the first premise in defense of premise 2. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then our actions are guaranteed by what we have no control over, since we have no control over the remote past before our births. Okay? So I'll repeat it again. And I gave the rationale there. I notice that I don't give a rationale on the slide. Okay, but I'll supply it again. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then our actions are guaranteed by what we have no control over. Why do I say that? Why is that true? Well, because we have no goddamn control over the remote past before our births. Do you have control over the remote past before you were born? No. So if our actions are guaranteed by the remote past before our births, then our actions are guaranteed by what we have no control over. Slash. Done. 2.2. If our actions are guaranteed by what we have no control over, then that means we have no control over whether we perform our actions. Well, why is that true? Well, the lack of control we have over the past would transfer, so to say, to what the past guarantees. I'll say it again. So 2.2. If our actions are guaranteed by what we have no control over, then we have no control over whether we perform our actions, since the lack of control we have over the past transfers to what the past guarantees. Ultimately, therefore, premise 2. If our actions are guaranteed by the remote past, then we have no control over whether we perform those actions. Okay. Now, the key question is whether premise 2.2 is true, because 2.1 is obviously true. You know, if your actions are shit out of the remote past before you were born, then that just means your actions are shit out of what you don't have any control over. No one's going to deny that. I mean, well, no one, quote unquote, relative to this context of an introductory course or any undergraduate course. Now, so the question is, why is 2.2 true? I kind of said why in a loose sense, and it is pretty intuitive, but think about it this way, in terms of my pen. If my lifting the pen right now, you see what? If my lifting the pen right now is guaranteed by what I have no control over, and remember, like, understand what's happening here. You can't be like, well, maybe you do have control over it, man. No, like that you have this. Just relax. We're assuming that we don't. Okay. If my lifting the pen right now is guaranteed by what I have objectively absolutely no control over, then it seems obvious that I have no control over the fact that I lift the pen right now. I have no control over whether I lift the pen right now. My lack of control over whether the sufficient cause of effect A occurring right now exactly as it does entails my lack of control over whether effect A occurs right now exactly how it in fact does. So you see, it parallels what we were talking about with the earlier 2.2, the abilities version 2.2. 2.2 is simply this 2.2, the control version, is simply an expression of the transfer principle for lack of control. We looked at the transfer principle for lack of ability. Now we're looking at the transfer principle for lack of control. The transfer principle for lack of control simply says, here, I have it right here. Let me take out my drawing tool. It simply says that we have no control over whether we perform what is guaranteed by what we have no control over. Economically put, you can't be any more decisive than that, it seems. I have no control. If my lifting the pen right now has been guaranteed by what I have no control over, then I don't have control over whether I lift the pen right now. That's just a statement of the transfer. That's a particular instance of the transfer principle of the lack of control. We have none of us have any control over whether we perform what is guaranteed by what we have no control over. Okay. Now, what about premise 3? What's premise 3 saying? Let's go back to premise 3. Premise 1 and premise 2 look pretty good. Premise 1 especially. Premise 2, I do know that compatibilists will set their sights on too. Now, number 3, actually, I don't know. I don't want to say ever, being a philosopher, but it's rare that someone's going to attack premise 3. Premise 3 simply says if we have absolutely no control over whether we perform an action, then that action is not done freely. Let's look at the rationale for it. This is just an expression of a principle. And that principle, in effect, is what I'm saying by saying that rarely will anybody attack premise 3. I'm saying, in effect, that that principle seems rather unassailable. You can word the principle like this, and it's simply, notice again, premise 3 in the contrapositive form. The freedom requires control principle, this obvious principle, is worded as follows. S does action A freely only if S has at least the merest sliver of, for the sake of the argument, we can make it the merest little sliver, infinitesimally small. S does action A freely only if S has at least some control over whether A happens. Think about it. If you have absolutely no control over whether you fling your arm this way, did you do it freely? No. Freedom requires control, at least a smidgen of control, for the sake of the argument. No one's going to object to that. No one, in quotes, because there will be people. But we're not going to go into any attack of that today. Instead, I'm going to show you the one area that compatibilists jump on. It's premise 2. Compatibilists, just like they are prone, sometimes at least, to attack the transfer principle for lack of ability, they're also prone to attack the transfer principle for lack of control. A compatibilist might attack, in effect, the transfer principle for lack of control, and thus attack premise 2, because premise 2 is just an articulation of that. So in other words, compatibilism might say, and we're at the objection here, we're at the compatibilist attack of premise 2. Compatibilism might say that sometimes we do have control over what we do, even if all our actions are guaranteed by the remote past that we have no control over. Okay? For example, according to this compatibilist strategy, even if it was guaranteed from the remote past that S, Sam, Sarah, whoever, does B, whatever B is, at time 1, it might still be the case that S has control over whether B happens at time 1. Concretely put in terms of my pen, my handy pen, I'm glad that I had it available. Well, I actually have a whole bunch of pens here. Concretely put in terms of my pen, according to this compatibilist strategy, even if it was guaranteed from the remote past, over which I have absolutely no control, that I do not lift the pen at time 1, it might still be the case that I have control over whether I lift the pen at time 1. You can make it not lift or lift, right? I can put it the other way. Even if it was guaranteed from the remote past, over which I have absolutely no control, that I do lift the pen at time 1, it might still be the case that I have control over whether I do so or not. That's the idea. That's what you must be saying if you are a person who rejects the transfer principle of lack of control. If you think, how could I still have control over whether I lift the pen at time 1 if it's guaranteed that I don't lift it? If it's guaranteed by what I have no control over that I don't lift it. If you think, if you're puzzled at that, you are a defender of, you find intuitive the transfer principle for lack of control that this compatibilist is now in the midst of attacking. So I imagine that to many, at least in my Texas audience, this is going to sound strange. So just like we did before with the compatibilist's strange maneuver in attacking the earlier premise 2, we're going to ask, how the hell can it be that even if it was guaranteed from the remote past that I have no ability to control, that I don't lift the pen at time 1, it could still be the case that I have control over whether I lift the pen at time 1? How could it be the case that even if it was shit out of the remote past that I don't lift the pen at time 1, I could still have control over whether I lift the pen at time 1? They have to give us some sort of account, some kind of explanation. They have to give some sort of account of what it means to have control, where that kind of way of thinking makes sense. And this is what they would say right here. Let me get my drawing tool out. Boop, right there. This is the compatibilist account of having control over what one does right here. I didn't label it as such, but okay, it's just for, I guess, economy on my slide. S has control over what he does at time 1 if and only if, IFF, if and only if S satisfies both the desire condition and the lack of coercion condition, or as I called it, I think in our last session, the lack of constraint condition. I don't know. Sometimes it's called the lack of coercion condition. Sometimes it's called the lack of constraint or the lack of unusual constraint condition. But you know what I mean. Boom. Go back. This I'm referring to our last session on compatibilism. Okay. So S has control over what S does at time 1 if and only if S satisfies the desire condition. In other words, S is doing what he wants to do, and also satisfies the lack of coercion condition, and in effect is not being, that means he's not being compelled to do what he does. So if you're doing what you want to do and you're not being coerced to do it, then you have control over whether you do it. Okay? And both of those two conditions, as we saw last time, can be met even if CD is true. At least that's what the compatibilist says. So you see, we'll go back to my example. If by not lifting the pen, I am doing what I want to do, I'm fulfilling the desire condition, and if no one is holding a gun to my hand and saying, don't lift the pen, then that's satisfying the lack of coercion condition. Then I have control over whether I lift the pen at time 1, even if my not lifting the pen has been guaranteed from time immemorial. Okay, that's the idea. So according to this account, clearly we can have control over our actions, even if all our actions are guaranteed by the remote past that we have no control over. Even if it was guaranteed by the remote past that I don't lift the pen at time 1, it may still be the case that I have control over whether I lift the pen at time 1, so long as I meet those two conditions, which arguably, the compatibilist says at least, can be met even if CD is true. So you guys see that? Now, I guess we've already seen how an incompatibilist would respond to this move. In fact, I guess we've already seen this when we talked about the 3 forms of compatibilism last time. Incompatibilism is not going to be too moved by this attack. Incompatibilism will respond, as we said last time, that this is at least to the coercion point, there's no relevant difference, metaphysically speaking, between being constrained or compelled by a gunpoint threat or by hypnosis, to use the Afghanistan-Bananistan example from last time, and being constrained, on the other hand, by the remote past when it comes to whether we have control over what we do. There's no relevant difference between being constrained by gunpoint threat or being constrained, on the other hand, by the remote past when it comes to whether we have control. In fact, if there's going to be any difference, we have less control. We have absolutely no control over what we do when what we do has been shit out of the past that we have absolutely no control over. The constraining, as I put it last time, by the remote past is much more unescapable than any hypnosis or gunpoint threats. So I'm not even going to go over. I've already attacked the desire condition last class, so that's kind of a review of when I just went over the attack of in effect, the lack of coercion condition. That was itself review, so I won't even go into the attack of the desire condition. But for an extra a response to this move against premise 2, you can go back to the previous video. All right. Now, I guess we can, another way to actually, this is not necessarily the consequence argument, but another way to express the point in defense of incompatibilism and to summarize incompatibilism from just a different perspective. I can put it like this. Let me just do a quick argument. Maybe it's not as rigorous. I'll put it in premise form, but maybe it's not as rigorous as the consequence versions of the argument, but the consequence arguments. But check this argument out. Premise 1. If chronological determinism is true, then my actions are the result of a force, I guess you can call alien to me. What would be that alien force? The past before I was born. So I'm capturing the same idea. Look at it this way. Premise one, if CD is true, then everything that I do is the result of a force that's alien to me, namely the past before my birth. Premise two, if my actions are the result of a force alien to me, then my actions are not free. Therefore, if CD is true, my actions are not free. That's just that's just capturing the idea of incompatibilism in yet a third way. We looked at two versions of the consequence argument. Here's the alien version, or the alien proof for incompatibilism. One, if CD is true, then my actions are a result of an alien force. That's obviously true. The force would be what was occurring before I was even born, so that's alien to me. If my actions are the result of a force alien to me, then my actions are not free. When you put those two premises together, by HS, what do you get? If CD is true, my actions are not free. So that's the spirit of incompatibilism, at least. Now, as a result of this session, you should be able to answer the following questions. What is incompatibilism? Okay. What is the main argument? It's simply, you can word all the views that we're going to look at in this moral freedom segment, and all the main views that there can be, in fact, are all in some sense related. You can relate them to the HCD argument, which is why I start off with the HCD argument. Incompatibilism affirms premise 2 of the HCD argument. Now, what is the main argument for incompatibilism? The consequence argument. There's two versions. And what's the difference between the two? One focuses on ability, the other focuses on control. You know, if I were to ask you to write about these things, I would ask you to go into more detail, but that's the basic gist of it. We just went through it. And now, what are the main problems that incompatibilism faces? Well, we saw, I guess, the attacks that compatibilism just raised for the various arguments. We had responses back on behalf of incompatibilism, but one of the severe ones that we didn't really maybe have, at least on the table, an adequate response to was the Harry Frankfurt worry, the Harry Frankfurt attack of premise 3 of the abilities version of the consequence argument. And maybe you can say this is maybe not super fair, but this is not super fair, I guess, to a form of to a view that we're going to look at next time called libertarianism. But another problem, or another potential problem, it's not really a philosophically robust problem for incompatibilism, is that it looks like if you accept incompatibilism, you're halfway there to accepting that no one's morally responsible for anything. And in fact, if my barrage of arguments that I gave you over the last two sessions for CD being true are, if they go through, if they're sound, then we're more than halfway there. It looks so. Look at it this way: if my case for CD being true is sound, then one problem you can in that framework. One of the main problems for incompatibilism is that to be an incompatibilist in that context is to thereby accept that no one's morally responsible for anything, which is something that a lot of us don't want to believe is the case. Even though, as I'm going to say probably on Moral Freedom Day 5, it's not as bad as you might think. All right, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks for participating here insofar as being attentive. I will see you next time. Peace.